Thanks for joining us for the latest episode of the Secure Connections podcast, brought to you by IoTSSA, the Internet of Things Security Services Association. I'm your host, Brian Sherman, Content Director for IoTSSA, and my guest on this episode is Zach Slade, Risk Management Consultant, Technology and Software for GCG Financial Services. Zach joined us for an enlightening episode on cyber security insurance last year and gave us a fantastic overview of the issues from a channel perspective. And I'm glad to welcome him back to continue that discussion today. We're happy to have you back on Secure Connections podcast, Zach.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Excited to be here and looking forward to our discussion.
Fantastic. First off, there's a lot of myths about cyber liability insurance and coverage. As you and I discussed, MSPs are often caught in the middle without the resources to answer their clients' questions a lot of times. And I hope we can address a few of those issues for our listeners today. So let's start out with everyone in the tech industry should understand the need for cyber liability insurance. I think from not just IoTSSA's discussions, but from general channel discussions, we're seeing this topic come up frequently. The questions many MSPs ask me is, why does it seem to be so complicated? What's the best way for MSPs and the clients to evaluate coverage options?
Yeah, so in terms of the complication, I think I touched on this last time, but just to reiterate, it's a somewhat new emerging coverage. I mean, looking at the history of all insurance coverages, cyber is one of the more recent additions. It's non-standardized. I break it into standardized and non-standardized. General liability insurance, workers' compensation insurance, the traditional insurance coverages don't vary a whole lot when you move from A-rated carrier to A-rated carrier, going from Travelers to Hartford to Hanover to CNA. It's pretty standard in terms of what's covered and what's not covered. Limits change, deductibles, things like that change. But in terms of what actual claim scenarios are covered, there's not a whole lot of variance. For the standard lines of insurance coverage, there's some, but not a lot. Cyber's not that way. Cyber varies a lot from carrier to carrier, which makes it confusing to certainly everybody in the industry. I'll read new forms that are published by some of the carriers that we work with, and I'll still look things up because they're calling as these attacks occur and as they create endorsements and forms to cover certain scenarios like ransomware, social engineering. Whenever new forms come out, we still have to go back and research it and call the underwriter and say, what does this actually mean? So that is why it's so confusing. To answer the second part of your questions, what do MSPs need to do in order to make sure that they have the best cyber coverage? I would say, number one, make sure you have a standalone cyber policy. Sometimes you'll see cyber built into a general liability package policy. Whenever you see that, I'd always ask to review it. In most cases, it's not the broadest coverage, so make sure you have a quality carrier. Make sure that the carrier is good at writing cyber. You should be able to ask your broker this, and then make sure it's standalone policy and that you're having conversations with your broker about it. Yeah.
So you mentioned a lot of variables too. So it's like one of those consulting things, like an MSP comes in and looks at the infrastructure. It's not a cut and paste. I'm not using the same thing I did for that client for this client. They should take a good look at all of the variables within your business, if you're an MSP, or your client's business, and tailor it to that particular, or tailor the coverage to that particular business's risks, I would assume.
I mean, that's exactly right. You want to make sure that you understand your insurance response to a cyber attack. That question is a question you probably want to ask your broker or whoever is handling your insurance. If there's a data breach, what does that look like? What are the insurance implications of that breach? How does my policy respond? And make sure that you have a very clear understanding of what's covered and what's not covered. But yes, we're seeing the industry get a little bit more consistent across at least industry, going from manufacturing to retail to healthcare. I would say the two different the two spaces where coverage varies more, and you want to make sure that you're being particularly careful is healthcare, things like HIPAA, and retail with coverages like PCI, which is both HIPAA and PCI liabilities fall under a cyber policy, and the policy needs to be properly endorsed and all that. But in general, yes, I would say you want to make sure that your cyber insurance policy is tailored for your specific business activities.
So in the channel, I think that's where it becomes, a bigger issue with a lot of providers too, because we've seen, the devastating effects of ransomware on not just the SMB, or their clients, but also on the MSP community themselves as well. So how does cyber insurance cover those incidents?
Well, so ransomware is one of those areas where the policy needs to be specifically endorsed. So you have, I'm going to back up a little bit. So I always break cyber coverage into first party and third party. So first party is the liabilities you would incur as a direct result of being breached, the expenses that you'd have to pay. Then there's the third party liabilities, which is, you're being held liable for somebody else's breach, which is great, where MSP should be aware of because they have a lot of exposure for third party. But under the first party section, there are certain endorsements that either cover. It's very specific. Either you have an endorsement for ransomware or you don't. And then within the endorsement, it's going to spell out, or it should spell out, how the response would be. So say there's a ransomware attack and you have the endorsement. Yeah, I mean your insurance policy should pay the bad actors to release the information.
So there's specific policies, I would assume, or specific directions within the policies of the remediation that takes place if you're hit with ransomware. Did you do A, B, C, D, E? And then if it's for clients, I would assume there's a similar requirement if you're an MSP.
Yeah, and we generally try to find an application. So I think what you're referring to is the application process when you're first starting the coverage. Is that right?
Yeah.
So I think there are something like 80 carriers doing cyber insurance right now. We try to find, we have 15 to 20 that we generally approach who we like and offer, we think, broad coverages. Out of those 15 to 20, we try to find an application that's generally accepted by the majority of them. So we're not having, our clients fill out 15 applications to approach, 15 carriers. The broad application that we currently use does ask, some questions about what's in place, but in general, it probably doesn't dive as deep as MSPs would expect. So what I would say is, when you're applying for coverage, make sure it's known that you want to be applying for ransomware coverage. There should be a portion of the application specifically for that, and yeah, definitely make sure it's on there.
Very good advice. And I know it's complicated. I'm trying to pin you into a corner on different things.
No, you're
80 different variables and 80 different companies, but that's, I think, why it's very important to be working with an expert when it comes to cybersecurity insurance too. So like a broker or others within the industry. I just think there's so, I won't say so little information, but there's so many questions, I think, still from the channel perspective of how do I ensure that all of my own business as well as my clients are all well protected. And obviously on the ransomware side is making sure that specific requirement or that specific coverage is included in their insurance policies. So that's the first step.
Yeah, ransomware, it's very clear. It's either you have coverage for it or you don't. So if you call your broker and you ask that question, they should be able to, within a couple of minutes, look at the policy and let you know. It's not, there are certain areas of cyber insurance that are more complicated than that. What's nice about ransomware and social engineering is there are specific endorsements, and it's very clear.
And then the remediation side too is making sure that they understand the steps that they need to take based on their specific coverage.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, in a recent conversation, you mentioned reverse social engineering, and I think we may have touched on that a little in our last conversation too. Can you explain what that means and how MSPs can protect themselves from these types of schemes and attacks?
Yeah, I'd love to just review what social engineering means for those people listening who may not know. I know it's so common now, where I'm assuming most of the audience has heard of this and is probably tired of hearing of it. But before I explain reverse, I should probably explain standard. Yeah. So social engineering is one of those areas of insurance I mentioned. Things are always changing, and different carriers are responding to the threats differently. Social engineering coverage is now a standard coverage that most carriers that are worth their salt writing cyber insurance are at least offering as an option to build onto a cyber insurance policy. What social engineering, the type of claim scenario that social engineering coverage would extend over would be if there's a phishing attempt and say, for example, someone in accounting gets an email from a vendor saying we recently changed bank accounts and we'd like for you to wire X amount of dollars from our old bank account to the new one. And the person at the company does that, right? So it's human error. That would be a classic social engineering claim. All right, now where this gets crazy, and the reverse social engineering is a fairly new coverage. I mean, we're talking within the past 12 months. Say, for example, that email that the accounting person receives to pay the vendor actually came from the vendor. So say the vendor's system was hacked, and the email, they got into the system and they were watching communication patterns, and they said, we recently changed vendors. Please, wire this new account, the payment. The party being attacked sends the money, and they say, well, but it came from the vendor. It was actually the vendor who sent the email. It wasn't, an outsider. It was from their system. It was somebody who got in their system and sent the email. That would be a reverse social engineering claim. So the way I look at it is social engineering. I view as a first party coverage because it'd be insurance reimbursement for the funds that your company sent to a bad actor. I view reverse social engineering as more of a third party coverage because it'd be, you're held liable because you didn't prevent somebody from getting into your system to implement a social engineering attack on somebody else, if that makes sense.
Definitely. So you need to have both types of coverage in place. If you're covered for social engineering, you're not necessarily covered for reverse social engineering. Is that accurate?
That's correct. Yeah, and I would say make sure you have social engineering coverage because that is the first party. That's right. The most common. Most claims fall into that category. So we would say make sure you have a broad social engineering policy. Also, make sure you understand if there are any conditions that are required for the company to pay. I think I mentioned in the last podcast this out-of-band condition, which essentially says unless you make a phone call to verify the legitimacy of the situation, the insurance company is not going to cover. We are seeing more and more carriers put those types of conditions on policies, so make sure that those conditions aren't there. But make sure you have social engineering. It's the social engineering coverage endorsement. It could also be referred to as cybercrime. Definitely make sure you have that coverage. Make sure you know the sublimit. Usually it's sublimited. So say you have a $1 million cyber policy, chances are you'll probably have a $100,000, $250,000 social engineering or cybercrime sublimit. And then there should also be a coverage section specifically for reverse social engineering on there as well. Yeah.
That makes sense. So now when it comes to either reverse social engineering or social engineering, is there typically a requirement in most insurance policies that the company be doing ongoing cyber security training or awareness training for their employees? Do you find that as a common stipulation, or does it not matter?
Mm-hmm. The policies we write, we don't like. The fewer stipulations, the better.
Right.
Some companies will try to sneak those in. There used to be a security maintenance exclusion which said that unless you update your systems in a timely fashion and do X, Y, and Z, we're not going to cover. We make sure we don't write policies with that exclusion. What I was wanted to get to though is that in terms of the assessment when there is a claim, you call the insurance company, they come in and they do their assessment. As long as you were accurately representing the situation to the best of your knowledge at the time you filled out the application, they're going to cover the claim. It's the carrier's obligation to, on an annual basis, if they're going to go in and do a review of the network security, that's their obligation to do that. Some carriers do it. It's more common for higher risk situations, like I mentioned, healthcare. But yeah, I mean, if you take out a cyber policy that's broad, and then 2 years later you have a social engineering attack, you have the right coverage, everything was written properly, and the carrier never came in, and you just happen to not, update your systems or do the appropriate testing that you should be. I mean, they'll cover that claim because again, they're representing the situation at the time of the application. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. Now you're talking about from the assessment side, something that MSPs are very comfortable with because they like to know that's uncovering all of the unknowns that may be there. Is it better for providers to look for those policies where they're doing an annual or 6-month assessment of the security situation for them or their clients so that they can address any of those issues proactively?
It certainly helps. I mean, on the application that we send out, the more questions that are answered favorably in terms of risk, I mean, the better the markets are going to respond. So you're going to have more carriers that are interested in writing the insurance, and you're probably going to get a more favorable premium. There are certain things like dual factor authentication. When's the last time you had your updates done? So they may decline. Say you're not doing anything that you should be. The carrier might come back and say, we're not going to write this because you're not protecting your systems the way you should be. And then and that's why I think it's great that the MSPs are working with insurance providers because they really complement each other very well. If I come into a situation and see that there's not dual factor authentication, they're not doing penetration testing, they're not doing all these things that they should be, I can easily bring in an MSP or somebody that can a network firm doing assessments, ESAs, to do that kind of stuff, and it's always viewed more favorably when it comes to underwriting. Yeah.
That makes sense. So the engagement, I think, on the insurance side is sometimes I think from talking to providers that I know, even at the events, is that they kind of see it as the insurance company versus MSP. And those I think that have been enlightened are starting to see the fact that you really do complement each other. If you find a good, reliable broker and agents to work with, I think it can be beneficial because you can help them drive business with their clients. But also the bigger concern, I think, lately is also making sure their own systems are locked down. So identifying any of those issues that could prevent them coverage or could, increase the risk on their own clients is something they need to know and something they need to address. And I think the community as a whole is definitely moving in that direction. What can we do to lock it down tighter? And then on the backside is we can do everything we can do, but if it fails, does the insurance company have my back? And I think that just makes sense to.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's the way that you've got to view it. Firms who view it like, I don't need to do all the things because I have insurance, or vice versa, just aren't getting the benefits of having both sides work together. Chances are they're not. The insurance provider doesn't know about all the security precautions that the company's taking, which could be reflected in terms of the underwriting, and you could potentially receive a discount in terms of premium. And the other side is true as well. The MSPs should be the ones in many cases filling out the insurance application or helping the client fill out the application.
So I know we touched on it a little before, but how can MSPs, we talked about ransomware, but how can MSPs ensure that they have the proper coverage with so many new threats? It's like every day we see some new cybersecurity risk that comes out. Okay, maybe not every day, but we're seeing a lot of new ones each year. How can they ensure that they're covered for, the gambit, whatever may hit their system or whatever may hit their client systems?
Yeah, I would say just familiarizing themselves with the coverages, with the forms. Read the policy they have in place. Stay up to date on the most recent trends. Form a partnership with an insurance broker who is up to speed on this, and we'd happy to be that partner for anybody who doesn't have that relationship currently in place. But just be up to speed, and when new forms and new coverages are coming out there, have a relationship. I get phone calls from MSPs will say, hey, what's new right now in cyber liability insurance? What are the newest endorsements that I should be aware of? And I'll talk about things like, like reverse social engineering. There are a couple other ones. Bricking is a new endorsement that audience should probably be aware of.
Bricking?
As well as, bricking. Yeah. So when a data breach happens, a lot of times what happens is the equipment, the property, business, personal property, computers, things like that, are sometimes rendered useless. Right. So insurance coverage to replace equipment that can't be reused after a data breach, that there's a certain coverage called bricking. And it's important to have that because a lot of times business owners think their property policy would cover equipment that was damaged as a result of a breach. That's actually not the case. There's a very specific exclusion in the property policy that excludes cyber-related events. So that was I think the industry motivation to create a coverage. And I think the term is brick means like the thing's useless. It's not a brick.
Yeah.
So the coverage is called bricking. Yeah.
Smartphones brick all the time.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's great. So I understand there are also some common exclusions in cyber liability insurance that MSP should know about. What are some of those?
Most common one that we see is social engineering, also referred to as cybercrime. I would say definitely make sure that you have that coverage. Bricking, I would say make sure that you have coverage to replace property that was damaged as a result of a breach. Voluntary shutdown is an area where there's now a specific coverage for that. It is if you shut down your system yourself and you lose revenue as a result of that shutdown. A lot of times that's viewed as an exclusion. So you think there's a breach and you shut your network down and you can't do business, and there wasn't a breach, but you did it to prevent a breach or to get ahead of a certain situation. You want to make sure that you have coverage for that type of situation.
So it covers you proactively if you're trying to stop or what you think is, that would seem like an interesting one to try to, what do I want to say, to validate, to send to an insurance company. Mm-hmm. A complicated process?
Not if you have the voluntary shutdown coverage. If you don't have the voluntary shutdown coverage, then that's going to be, they'll probably decline.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Any others?
Common ones that we see: business interruption as a result of a data breach. So companies have a separate business interruption policy, similar to property. Events that occur, cyber-related events, are excluded. So business interruption coverage falls under the cyber policy. Sometimes we'll see companies thinking they have business interruption coverage under their standard non-cyber business interruption policy, and we'll tell them that no, you actually don't. You need to make sure that your coverage is broadened to cover business interruption. But that's an area where the market's got a little more consistent. So it's uncommon that we view a policy that doesn't have business interruption listed under the cyber section. What's more common is there's a term called contingent business interruption. So it's more common for us to review a policy and find no coverage for contingent business interruptions. That would be the cost associated with you not being able to operate as a result of somebody else's breach. So another company that you work with has a data breach. It could be your internet provider. Say your internet provider has a data breach and they can't provide you internet, and you lose money as a result of their data breach. That would be contingent business interruption, which oftentimes we'll review a policy that will not have contingent BI coverage.
That makes a tremendous amount of sense. I know some providers that actually said they look at different aspects of their insurance coverage options and review it with an attorney, for example. And I know a lot of great attorneys, but at the same point is these seem like things that an attorney might not understand themselves too, unless they're in insurance law. Really good reason to work with consultants that understand cyber liability insurance. Not a question, just a statement, but boy, when you think about all the different variables here, I can see why it's important to sit down and understand from an MSP's perspective their own coverage, the exclusions, and then also figure out how to take that same thing to each of their clients and make sure that they have similar coverage based on the risks that they have and the compliance measures they have to meet. Most of the MSPs I know have dozens of clients with dozens of different situations to address. So I can see definitely the value of working with a cyber liability insurance expert. So what other things do MSPs need to know about cyber liability insurance? I think we covered quite a bit, Zach, but have we left anything out?
Yeah. Oh, not off the top of my head. I think, just I'd say have a partnership, with a broker, get your attorney involved, and just stay up to speed on all this. It's hard off the top of my head to, answer that question, but just stay up to date and know what's going on, and definitely talk about it with your clients. Bring it up. Ask, do you even have cyber liability insurance? And do you understand your insurance response to a cyber attack? To be well versed in some of the things that we just talked about, like ransomware and social engineering. But yeah, just I'm repeating myself, but stay up to speed.
Yeah. So develop a partnership, find somebody they're comfortable working with, I would assume, before they kind of take that to market. And it might not even be to market, but you're bringing for example, your expertise with the managed service providers, technology expertise and process expertise to the client, and reviewing it and making sure that they have the proper coverage. And more importantly, they proactively have the measures in place to make sure they don't ever have to use that coverage. I think that's the win-win for everybody.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very good. How can MSPs get in contact with you if they have questions?
Well, I'd love to give you my information. You have it already ready, but if you want to post it so it's on the podcast, that would be great. We'd be happy to talk to any MSPs that have questions, or anybody who, outside of MSPs that, are interested in cyber liability insurance.
Learning more about it. Very good. Any resources that you can share too, or they can learn more information? I'm not sure if the company has a website dedicated to different recommendations or steps. I know that's a legal thing, but if you have any recommendations on resources, we'd love to hear it.
Interesting question. We're in the process of building out a technology page. We have a technology vertical, and we're in the process of creating a more a website with that type of portal and information on it. I don't think we have anything that's external right now, but we're in the process of certainly building that. Happy to, again, though, share if anybody wants to give me a call or shoot me an email with specific questions. I'd be happy to answer those questions.
Very good. And I believe your company and others will even be involved, like ChannelCon coming up will be around. So if I definitely encourage our audience to make sure that they're in touch with a company like yours, whether it's GCG Financial or others, to understand and spend some time learning what the coverage levels are, and maybe engage, hopefully, to work with their clients as well. So any final recommendations or thoughts before we sign off today?
Well, I'm very excited about the podcast that we're going to do here next month. I just would love to just briefly touch on that and talk about how it relates. So we're doing this panel series. It's myself. It's a gentleman who does enterprise security assessments. Then there's a firm that does software monitoring, threat detection. So what's really interesting, and this touches on what you said about the relationship between MSPs and cyber liability insurance providers like myself. Kind of rethinking those dynamics. What we're doing is the way we view it is pre, current, and post. So the firm doing the enterprise security assessments is looking at the security of the firm and all that, and assessing it. And they're transactional. They'll come into the penetration testing. They'll look at everything and they'll say, okay, here's what you need to do. And then that's the pre. The current is the software that's detecting threats as they emerge. It's kind of running in the background, and MSPs, from my understanding, can subscribe to use this software. So I'm sure for the MSPs that are listening, it would be a great podcast to have you tune in on next time. But then there's the post, which is me, right? And getting those three parties talking, and me being able to communicate a company that's involved in all three to the underwriting. That's awesome. I think this is kind of a new situation, having those heads talk that generally don't. So I think that's going to be a great podcast for the audience. And I'm excited to be a part of it.
Awesome. Thanks for that teaser, because that should be a fun discussion, because it's really, let's talk about putting all of these things into action, especially the engagement with the channel, as well as some of the unique security specialists, in addition to the cyber liability insurance experts. So that'll be coming up. We're going to be doing that panel later next month. And as soon as that's ready to go, we'll definitely get that out to the audience. So on behalf of IOTSSA, I'd like to thank Zach Slade from GCG Financial for joining us today, as well as to you, our listeners, for tuning into this episode. Please take a couple more minutes and check out all the great cybersecurity content on the association's website, IoTSSA.com. Thanks again, and be sure to watch for the next episode of Secure Connections podcast. Good day.